Hey everyone, this is Mike and welcome to F2F Tech. Today we're looking at a legendary card that brought high-end performance to the masses, NVIDIA's GeForce 8800 GT. Released in October of 2007, the GT was based off a slightly revised 65nm version of the G80, dubbed the G92. The G92-based 8800 GT had less shaders, ROPs, and memory bandwidth compared to the 8800 GTX, but it did have more transistors. And while a lot of those transistors were used for the new on-chip video processing engine, some were used to enhance the overall performance of the chip. I always thought the 8800 GT had a bit of an odd naming scheme, as it should have been part of the 9000 series. Well, oddly enough, it was eventually rebadged as the 9800 GT, but it should have been called that from the start. NVIDIA made matters worse with the 8800 GTS 512, but let's not get into that right now. Well, regardless of the naming scheme, this was the people's champ. NVIDIA, without any threat from ATI at the time, essentially cannibalized their entire 8800 GTS lineup and even made the GTX seem like a pretty terrible value by comparison. NVIDIA eventually released 256MB versions of the 8800 GT, available for the under $200 mark, and a lot of the 512MB models were also being sold around the $200 mark not long after release. It really didn't matter if you were an ATI or NVIDIA guy. If you were a PC gamer at the time, this was the card to get. Well, about a month after the 8800 GT released, ATI did have an answer in the form of an HD 3870, but it still wasn't enough to dethrone the mid-range champ. We'll also revisit that battle in the future. Now, the card we're looking at today was purchased online, and it happens to be a factory overclocked BFG card. This card uses the reference single slot cooler, and it happens to have that awesome bald guy BFG sticker as well. I'm pretty sure this was supposed to be like an asylum patient, but it's still a pretty odd mascot if you ask me. Anyway, after removing the heatsink, we were greeted with the G92 GPU. Now, gone is the IHS found on the G80 family of GPUs. Now we have direct contact with the die. And looking at the heatsink, we can see the cloth-like thermal pads are still in decent shape, and the thermal paste is dried up as expected. So I cleaned up the card and removed all the dust, and after that I applied some fresh thermal paste, and now we're ready for benching. Before we jump into the benchmarks, let's take a quick look at overclocking. Now, this card comes with a factory 25MHz overclock on the core, but we'll be dialing that back down to reference speeds for testing purposes. I was able to achieve an overclock of 720MHz on the core, which is a 20% increase over stock. I was also able to increase the memory clock to 1GHz, which is 11% over stock. Since we recently looked at the 8800 GTX, the 8800 Ultra, and the Radeon 2900 XT, we'll be including their results in the recently revised test suite as well. Now, I'm pushing all these cards pretty hard as I do intend to add more powerful DX10 cards to the graphs in the future. Alright, well, on to the benchmarks. The first game up is Grand Theft Auto 5, and here we're using the normal settings throughout with 16x AF. The GT averaged 30 frames per second, and after dialing in our overclock, performance rose 16% to 35. Now, the GT's overclock performance was dead even with the overclocked GTX, which is very impressive. Now, frame times were also very solid on all the cards tested here. Now let's take a look at an older title, Stalker Call of Pripyat. Now, using the high preset with DX10, the GT averaged 47 frames per second, and after applying our overclock, we saw a 12% uplift to 53. Now, while overclock performance nearly matched the stock GTX, the big boys with the extra VRAM and more stream processors still fared much better overall. Still, all the cards had a fair amount of stutter towards the latter portion of the benchmark, which does utilize a lot of VRAM. Now let's jump into a newer DX10 title, Sniper Elite 3. Now, using the medium preset, the GT averaged 29 frames per second, and that number rose 17% to 34 with our overclocks. A very good showing for the GT. Now, overclocked, it was only 5% slower compared to the overclocked Ultra, and frame times were actually pretty good throughout most of the capture, but all of the cards experienced a couple large 100 millisecond and beyond spikes, which is reflected in our numbers. Now let's mosey on back to an older classic, Crysis, and we're using the medium preset with DX10 and no AA. the GT averaged 46 frames per second, and after dialing in our overclock, that number jumped up 10% to 51. Now we're seeing the stock GT beat out the GTX, and overclocked it's only 5% slower than the Ultra. Frame times were just okay for most of the cards, but the 2900 XT got hit the hardest. The 2013 version of Tomb Raider is up, and we went all out on this one using the high preset at 1080p. The GT averaged 29 frames per second, and overclock it rose 20% to 35. This title tends to favor NVIDIA cards, but these are some pretty solid numbers considering these settings. Frame times on the GT improved quite a bit once overclocked, as did the rest of the NVIDIA cards. Now let's take a look at another game from 2013, BioShock Infinite, and here we're using the medium preset at 1080p. The GT averaged 27 frames per second, and overclocked that number rose 18% to 32. Again, frame times did improve after overclocking, but all these cards tested had some inconsistent frame times with this title, as I think 1080p was a bit much. Now on to the newest game in our test suite, Total War Attila. Now at 720p with the lowest graphics preset, the 8800 GT averaged 21 frames per second, and overclocked that number rose 19% to 25. Now the overclocked GT was dead heat with the overclocked Ultra in this title, which was impressive. The 2900 XT had a chance to flex some of its muscles in this game as well. Sadly, most of the cards delivered the same-ish experience, which was pretty crap. Hitman Absolution is up next, and using the medium preset, the GT averaged 29 frames per second, and overclocked that number jumped up 13% to 33. Now overclocked, the GT shot past that not-so-magical 30 FPS mark, but it still isn't terrible considering the resolution and settings. Now frame times were great for all the cards tested, minus the 2900 XT sadly. Next we have Metro Last Light Redux, and now we're using the medium settings with 16x AF, and the GT averaged 37 frames per second. Overclocked, that number rose 10% to 41. Seems the GT couldn't keep up with the big boys in this title, but it still wasn't a terrible showing. Now FPS variability is common using the built-in benchmark, which makes our 1% and 0.1% lows look a bit off, but all the cards displayed very solid frame times, which we've seen time and time again with this title. Now let's take a look at the last game in our benchmark suite, Sleeping Dogs. Here we use the medium preset at 1080p. Now the GT averaged 27 frames per second, and overclocked that number rose 14% to 31. Now we can see the GT was neck and neck with the GTX in average frame rate, and it even held its own with the Ultra. Now sadly, due to the lack of VRAM, it suffers with inconsistent frame times compared to its big brothers. Oddly enough, the 2900 XT has the most VRAM, but it still couldn't keep pace with the NVIDIA cards. Now let's take a look at the 10-game average performance for all of the cards tested. Now focusing on the 8800 GT, at stock frequencies it's 27% faster than the 2900 XT, it's 8% slower compared to the 8800 GTX, and it's 18% slower versus the 8800 Ultra. After overclocking the GT, we can see it's now 46% faster than the stock 2900 XT, it's 6% faster than the 8800 GTX, but even with the overclock, it's still 3% slower than the stock fastest card of 2007, the 8800 Ultra. Alright, now let's jump over to power consumption. Now these numbers are taken at the wall using the Witcher 2 to stress our system, and here we can see the system with the stock 8800 GT pulled 160 watts at the wall. Overclocked, that number rose 7% to 172. Now compared to the other cards tested, this card does sip some power. Now let's take a look at GPU temperature and fan speed. Now we're using Crysis to get our temps moving in an ambient of 17°C, which is pretty cold. And we can see the single slot cooler doesn't do the best job cooling the card with BFG's conservative fan curve. Now with the fan speed set to auto, the GT topped out at 79°C, and the fan was stabilizing at around 41%. Now when applying our overclock, I ramped up the fan speed to 100%, and it kept the card cooler at 70°C under load. Now the single slot cooler isn't great, and it's not particularly quiet, as I much prefer the more robust dual slot solutions found on the big G80 cards. As we move into our conclusion, I found it pretty neat to see how well these cards hold up in mostly newer DX9 and DX10 games. Now the 8800 GT holds up very well against its bigger brothers in a lot of the games that we tested. The GT has 14% less stream processors compared to the GTX and the Ultra, and it has over 50% memory bandwidth deficit as well. Now regardless, it still keeps up pretty well at stock frequencies, and even better when overclocked. Now I know if we were using nothing but older titles, the GTX and the Ultra probably would have distanced themselves a bit more, as all the cards tested probably haven't seen much in the way of driver optimizations for the majority of the new games that we tested. Now I will be adding more cards to the charts in the future, such as the HD 3870, the HD 4870, the GTX 280, and more. I'll also periodically upload updates to this benchmark suite to help cover some of the cards that I've already tested, so keep an eye out for those in the future. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the current review of this nostalgic card. If you have any questions regarding the cards tested, the testing methodology, or anything else, please feel free to leave a comment below. Also, feel free to check out my affiliate links in the description. Every little bit helps me buy additional tech and test stuff here on the channel. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video, and happy holidays.